They had him for 48 hours. 48 hours of interrogation, torture, and the slow realization that no one was coming to save him. Dr. Michael Harrison, the bioweapons expert who held secrets that could shift the balance of global power, had been written off by his own government. Too dangerous to rescue, too valuable to let die, too compromised to trust if he ever made it home alive. The terrorists who had taken him from the convoy in the mountains of Afghanistan believed they had won the ultimate prize. A man whose knowledge could arm them with weapons that would make conventional forces obsolete. They celebrated. They planned. They counted their victory before it was complete. What they didn't know was that three shadows were already moving through the darkness toward their mountain fortress, and that the man they thought was helpless had left a trail only the most elite soldiers in the world could follow. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of brotherhood, sacrifice, and the moment when the impossible became routine for three soldiers who refused to let one of their own die in enemy hands, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe that some bonds are stronger than orders, stronger than odds, stronger than the fear of death itself, hit that subscribe button. These stories remind us that legends are written by people who refuse to accept that anyone is ever truly lost. The Hindu Kush mountains of eastern Afghanistan rise like ancient fortresses from the earth, their peaks cutting into skies that have witnessed centuries of conflict, conquest, and the endless cycle of armies that came seeking victory and found only the implacable endurance of stone and snow. Among these peaks, in a valley that appeared on no public maps and was known only to intelligence agencies and the fighters who used it as sanctuary, sat a compound that had been carved from the living rock by men who understood that survival required invisibility. The compound was not large, perhaps a dozen buildings connected by tunnels that had been hewn from granite by hand, protected by natural barriers that made conventional assault nearly impossible. Approaching from the east meant crossing exposed ridgelines that could be observed for miles. From the west, sheer cliffs rose 3,000 feet, with no practical climbing routes. The north face was protected by a glacier field that claimed the lives of experienced mountaineers in good weather, and the south approach required crossing valleys controlled by local tribes whose loyalty could shift with the wind and the promise of better payment. For the men who had built this sanctuary, isolation was not just tactical advantage. It was survival itself. They had learned through decades of war that the most dangerous enemy was not the soldier who faced you in open battle, but the pilot flying aircraft too high to see, guided by satellites that turned mountain strongholds into target coordinates for weapons that fell from the sky without warning. So they had built their fortress not to dominate the landscape, but to disappear into it, becoming part of the mountain itself, until even they sometimes forgot where the stone ended and their handiwork began. Dr. Michael Harrison had been unconscious when they brought him to the compound, his body showing the effects of the improvised explosive device that had destroyed his convoy and killed the 8 soldiers assigned to protect him. When he regained consciousness 18 hours later, he found himself in a room carved from solid rock, illuminated by electric lights powered by a generator whose diesel rumble seemed to emerge from the mountain itself. Harrison was not a soldier, had never been trained for capture or interrogation, and understood the situation with the clarity that came from 20 years of working in classified programs that prepared for exactly the scenario. He was a bioweapons expert, one of perhaps 12 people in the world who understood both the theoretical science and practical application of engineered pathogens that could serve as strategic weapons. His knowledge was valuable enough that his captors would keep him alive, but that same knowledge made him too dangerous for his own government to risk recovering through conventional means. The men who had taken him were not typical insurgents. They spoke multiple languages fluently, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both military tactics and advanced technology, and moved with the disciplined coordination that marked professional training rather than ideological enthusiasm. Their leader, who introduced himself only as Commander Zarek, possessed knowledge of classified programs that suggested intelligence sources at levels that made Harrison's capture seem less like opportunistic terrorism and more like precisely planned strategic operation. Dr. Harrison, Zarek had said during their first conversation, "Your government believes you are already dead. The attack on your convoy was reported as completely successful with no survivors. Officially, you no longer exist. Harrison had no reason to doubt this assessment. The explosion that destroyed the convoy had been devastating, and his survival was due more to chance than planning. If a security detail had believed him dead, they would have followed protocols that prioritized preventing enemy exploitation of his knowledge over attempting rescue operations with uncertain probability of success. But what neither Harrison nor his captors understood was that his disappearance had triggered responses that existed outside official channels. Protocols that had been established by men who valued loyalty over policy and who measured success not by strategic calculations, but by the simple principle that no one gets left behind. 3,000 miles away, in a facility that officially didn't exist, Master Sergeant Cole Rodriguez received notification of Harrison's status change through channels that bypassed normal military communication systems. The message was brief, encrypted at levels that required special clearance to decode, and signed with authentication codes that only a handful of people were authorized to use. Rodriguez had worked with Harrison on 3 separate classified projects over the past 4 years, operations that had required the kind of close coordination between military personnel and civilian specialists that created bonds extending far beyond professional relationships. Harrison wasn't just another government scientist requiring protection. He was someone Rodriguez trusted, respected, and considered family in a way that only developed between people who had shared risks that couldn't be discussed in official reports. The message contained Harrison's last known coordinates, intelligence assessments about the group responsible for his capture, and a final line that made Rodriguez understand exactly what kind of situation they were facing. Asset presumed compromised. Recovery operations deemed inadvisable. File closure pending confirmation of status. Rodriguez had seen similar messages before, usually involving operations that had gone wrong in ways that made official acknowledgement impossible. File closure pending confirmation of status was bureaucratic language that meant Harrison was being written off, abandoned to whatever fate his captors decided, because the risks of rescue exceeded the value of recovery as calculated by people who had never worked with him personally. Rodriguez walked across the compound to a building that housed the kind of soldiers whose capabilities were whispered about in military circles but never officially acknowledged. The 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, known to most people simply as Delta Force, but understood by people who worked with them as operators whose training and experience prepared them for missions that conventional forces couldn't attempt. He found Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and Sergeant First Class David Kim in the equipment warehouse, conducting maintenance on gear that looked standard issue but performed to specifications that exceeded anything available through normal military supply channels. Both men had worked with Rodriguez and Harrison on operations that required the kind of seamless coordination between military and civilian personnel that developed through shared experiences in places where failure meant death for everyone involved. "We need to talk," Rodriguez said, showing him the message he had received. Unofficially, Webb and Kim read the message with expressions that revealed both professional assessment and personal anger. They had learned to trust Harrison's judgment in situations where bad intelligence or poor planning could get people killed, and they understood that his knowledge and expertise had saved lives during operations that would never appear in any official record. "So they're just leaving him there?" Kim asked, his voice carrying the controlled fury that marked soldiers whose loyalty had been tested by bureaucratic decisions that prioritized political considerations over the lives of people who had earned better treatment. "That's what the message says," Rodriguez replied. "But the message doesn't have to be the final word." Webb looked at the intelligence assessment included with the message, studying the location, terrain features, and estimated enemy strength with the analytical attention that had kept them alive through deployments in locations where American forces weren't supposed to be operating. This is a hard target. Natural defenses, limited approach routes, unknown number of hostiles. It's exactly the kind of mission that gets classified as inadvisable, which is exactly why no one will expect us to attempt it, Rodriguez said, and exactly why it might work. The plan that emerged from their conversation was built on principles that had guided special operations for decades: surprise, superior training, and the willingness to accept risks that conventional forces couldn't justify. They would operate without official authorization, using equipment and resources they had legitimate access to, but applying them to a mission that existed outside normal command structures. Rodriguez would use his intelligence contacts to develop detailed information about the compound where Harrison was being held. Webb would handle route planning and extraction logistics, identify approach routes that avoided detection, and escape plans that could succeed even if the primary mission went wrong. Kim would manage equipment and communications, ensuring they had everything needed for an operation in terrain and conditions that would test every piece of gear they carried. The mission would be unauthorized, unsupported, and undocumented. If they succeeded, Harrison would be rescued by operators whose actions would never be officially acknowledged. If they failed, 3 elite soldiers would disappear into the mountains of Afghanistan with no record of their presence and no explanation for their absence. "Are we clear about what we're doing?" Rodriguez asked. "Once we cross the line, there's no official backup, no air support, no extraction if things go wrong. We're on our own." Webb and Kim exchanged glances that communicated understanding developed through years of operations where success depended on trust between people whose lives were literally in each other's hands. "We're clear," Webb said. "Harrison would do the same for any of us." Kim nodded agreement. Some things are more important than following orders. The intelligence development phase of their unauthorized mission took 18 hours, and resources that Rodriguez accessed through contacts who understood that some requests didn't require explanations. Satellite imagery, communication intercepts, and human intelligence reports created a picture of the compound that was detailed enough for tactical planning, but incomplete enough to guarantee surprises that could prove fatal. The facility was smaller than conventional military installations, but better protected than most fixed defensive positions. Natural barriers limited approach routes to 3 possibilities, each presenting unique challenges that would test different aspects of their training and equipment. The eastern approach offered concealment but required crossing exposed terrain, where detection would mean immediate engagement with hostile forces. The western route provided better cover but involved technical climbing that would be dangerous in daylight and potentially impossible in darkness. The southern approach, which Webb eventually selected as their primary route, required crossing territory controlled by local tribes whose loyalties were uncertain, but who could be avoided through careful route selection and timing. More importantly, the southern approach led to the compound's weakest defensive positions, areas where the builders had relied on natural barriers rather than constructed fortifications. The intelligence also revealed information about Harrison's captors that explained why conventional rescue operations had been deemed inadvisable. The group holding him possessed sophisticated weapons, demonstrated professional tactical training, and had access to communication systems that suggested support from organized military forces rather than typical insurgent networks. But the same intelligence that made the mission dangerous also revealed opportunities that skilled operators could exploit. The compound's isolation, which made conventional assault difficult, also meant that the defenders had limited options for reinforcement if their perimeter was breached. Their reliance on natural defenses created choke points that could be turned against them by attackers who understood mountain warfare tactics. Most importantly, the intelligence suggested that Harrison was being held in a specific area of the compound, reducing the search time that would be required once they gained access to the facility. Every minute spent inside hostile territory increased the probability of detection, engagement, and mission failure. So precise intelligence about Harrison's location was crucial for mission success. Rodriguez, Webb, and Kim spent 12 hours studying intelligence, developing contingency plans for situations they hoped wouldn't occur, and rehearsing procedures that would have to be executed perfectly under stress that could compromise judgment and coordination. They had worked together long enough to function as a unit without extensive communication, but the unauthorized nature of their mission meant they couldn't rely on the support systems that normally sustained special operations. Their equipment selection reflected both the technical requirements of mountain warfare and the operational security needs of a mission that couldn't be traced to official sources. Standard issue weapons and communications gear, but selected and modified to specifications that maximized performance in the specific terrain and conditions they would encounter. climbing equipment that met technical standards for the mountain environment, but was generic enough to avoid identification if discovered. Medical supplies sufficient for treating serious injuries, but compact enough to carry during extended operations in difficult terrain. Most critically, they equipped themselves with navigation and communication systems that would allow them to coordinate their actions without relying on external support. They would enter the target area with everything needed to complete the mission, knowing that once they crossed into hostile territory, they would have access only to resources they carried with them. The final element of their preparation was psychological, accepting that they were choosing loyalty to a friend over obedience to official policy, and that the consequences of this choice would follow them regardless of whether their mission succeeded or failed. They were violating regulations, disobeying orders, and risking their careers and freedom for the principle that some obligations transcended bureaucratic considerations. "Last chance to reconsider," Rodriguez said as they prepared for departure. "Once we cross the border, we're committed." Webb checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that every piece of gear was secure and accessible. "I've been thinking about this for 18 hours. Harrison saved my life in Syria and Kim's life in Iraq. I'm not going to let bureaucracy decide that his life isn't worth the risk." Kim nodded agreement. "We've all been in situations where following orders would have gotten people killed. This is one of those situations, except the orders are telling us to let someone die instead of taking action to save them." Rodriguez understood that his teammates had reached the same conclusion he had, that some decisions couldn't be made by people who hadn't shared the experiences that created bonds stronger than regulations. "Then we go. 48 hours to get in, find Harrison, and get out. After that, we deal with whatever consequences follow." The infiltration phase of their mission began at 0230 hours local time, under cover darkness that provided concealment, but also created navigation challenges that could prove fatal in mountain terrain. Rodriguez, Webb, and Kim approached the target area, using a route that avoided known observation posts and population centers, moving with the disciplined patience that marked operators whose survival depended on remaining undetected. The terrain was more difficult than satellite imagery had suggested, with loose rock that threatened to create noise discipline problems and weather conditions that reduced visibility, while increasing the physical demands of movement at altitude. Each man carried approximately 60 pounds of equipment, including weapons, ammunition, climbing gear, medical supplies, and communication systems needed for an operation that could last several days if extraction proved complicated. Their movement was methodical rather than fast, prioritizing stealth over speed because detection at any point during the approach would compromise the entire mission. They used terrain features for concealment, avoided skylining themselves against ridges where their silhouettes could be observed, and maintained spacing that prevented a single enemy observation or engagement from affecting the entire team. Rodriguez led the approach, using his experience in mountain warfare to select routes that minimize exposure while maintaining progress toward the objective. Webb followed, providing overwatch and communication support while monitoring for signs of enemy activity that could indicate compromised security. Kim served as rear guard, ensuring they weren't being followed and maintaining situational awareness of their escape routes in case rapid withdrawal became necessary. The first 12 hours of infiltration proceeded without contact, but the physical demands of high-altitude movement in difficult terrain began to test even their exceptional conditioning. Mountain warfare required different energy management than other environments, and a combination of reduced oxygen, heavy equipment loads, and technical terrain created fatigue that could compromise decision-making when precision was most critical. At 1,447 hours, they reached the observation position they had selected for a final reconnaissance of the target compound. From a concealed position approximately 800 meters from the facility, they used high-powered optics to study defensive positions, guard rotations, and activity patterns that would determine the timing and approach for their assault. The compound appeared larger when observed directly than satellite imagery had suggested, with additional defensive positions that had been concealed from overhead surveillance. Guard rotations followed patterns that suggested professional security procedures rather than casual defensive measures. and the presence of heavy weapons positions indicated that the defenders were prepared for organized assault by forces larger than the typical insurgent groups that operated in the region. But detailed observation also revealed weaknesses that could be exploited by operators with appropriate training and equipment. Guard positions that provided excellent fields of fire in some directions, but had blind spots that could be used for concealed approach. Communication systems that appeared sophisticated but follow predictable patterns that could be disrupted at critical moments. Most importantly, a section of the compound's perimeter where natural rock formations provided cover close enough to the facility to allow rapid movement during the final assault phase. "There," Webb whispered, pointing toward a section of the compound where building layout suggested the kind of secure areas used for holding valuable prisoners. Single entrance, limited windows, guards posted but following routine patterns. Kim studied the area through a scope. Identify approach routes and potential complications. Looks like 2 guards on rotation, changing every 4 hours. Next change would be around 1800 hours. Rodriguez analyzed the tactical situation, weighing the advantages of immediate action against the benefits of waiting for optimal conditions. If we move during the guard change, we'll have maybe a 10-minute window while they're adjusting positions and communications. After that, any deviation from routine will be noticed. The decision to assault during the evening guard change reflected calculations that balanced multiple variables, lighting conditions that would provide concealment for their approach while allowing sufficient visibility for precision operations, guard rotation timing that would minimize the probability of detection during the critical initial phase, and weather patterns that would mask sound while not creating conditions that would compromise their equipment or coordination. They used the remaining daylight hours to prepare equipment, review procedures, and conduct final coordination that would allow them to function as a unit during the assault phase when communication would be limited and coordination would depend on shared understanding of objectives and procedures. At 1,742 hours, they began their final approach to the compound, moving individually through terrain that provided concealment but required technical skills that tested their mountain warfare training. The approach route Webb had selected brought them to within 50 meters of the compound perimeter, close enough for rapid assault, but far enough to avoid detection by guards whose attention was focused on more distant threats. Rodriguez reached the perimeter first, using natural cover to observe the guard change that would provide their window of opportunity. The transition was professional but not perfect. A brief period when outgoing guards had departed their positions, but incoming guards had not yet established full situational awareness of their assigned sectors. At 1803 hours, Rodriguez signaled the assault phase to begin. The initial breach of the compound perimeter occurred with a silent precision that marked operations by soldiers whose training had prepared them for exactly this type of infiltration. Rodriguez neutralized the first guard with techniques that ensured no alarm could be raised, while Webb and Kim moved through defensive positions with coordinated timing that prevented detection by remaining security forces. The compound interior layout was more complex than intelligence had suggested, with corridors that connected buildings and patterns designed to confuse attackers and delay movement toward critical areas. But the same defensive design that complicated navigation also provided concealment for operators who understood how to use architectural features for tactical advantage. They moved as a unit through passages carved from living rock, using hand signals and predetermined procedures to maintain coordination, while minimizing the communication that could compromise their position. Each intersection required careful reconnaissance. Each doorway presented potential ambush sites, and each step forward committed them further to a course of action that would succeed completely or fail catastrophically. The section of the compound where intelligence suggested Harrison was being held required crossing an open courtyard that provided no concealment and was overlooked by guard positions that had not been neutralized. Webb identified a route that minimized exposure time but required precise timing and coordination that would test their ability to function as a unit under conditions where mistakes would be immediately fatal. Rodriguez moved first, using shadows and architectural features to reach the far side of the courtyard undetected. Kim followed, providing overwatch while Webb prepared to cross the most exposed section of their route. The coordination was flawless, each man reaching his assigned position without detection, but the process consumed time that reduced their operational window for completing the primary mission. The building where Harrison was believed to be held showed signs of recent activity, but appeared lightly guarded, suggesting either confidence in the compound's overall security or concentration of defensive forces in areas the assault team had not yet encountered. Rodriguez approached the entrance with techniques designed to detect booby traps or alarm systems that could compromise their mission, while Webb and Kim established overwatch positions that would allow them to respond to threats from multiple directions. The door was secured with a lock that Kim bypassed using tools and techniques that left no evidence of tampering, important for maintaining operational security even after their mission was complete. The interior corridor was dimly lit, with doors leading to rooms that could contain Harrison, additional prisoners, or defensive positions occupied by hostile forces. Rodriguez moved down the corridor with systematic precision, checking each room for threats and objectives, while Webb and Kim maintained security at the entrance and prepared for rapid extraction if the situation required immediate withdrawal. The building's interior was larger than external observation had suggested, with additional levels and passages that complicated search procedures and consumed time they couldn't afford to lose. The third room Rodriguez entered contained Dr. Michael Harrison. Harrison was conscious but showed signs of interrogation and confinement that indicated his captors had been extracting information through methods that would require medical attention once they reached safety. But he was mobile, alert, and capable of participating in his own rescue, critical factors for extraction through terrain that would challenge even healthy individuals. "Dr. Harrison," Rodriguez whispered, "we're here to get you out. Can you move?" Harrison's response demonstrated both relief and professional assessment of their situation. "I can move. How many of you are there? And what's the extraction plan?" "3 of us. Extraction on foot through mountain terrain to a pickup point approximately 20 kilometers from here. We need to move immediately." Harrison nodded, understanding that detailed explanations would consume time they might not have. "I'm ready." Rodriguez helped Harrison to his feet, conducting a quick assessment of his physical condition and distributing equipment that would be needed during the extraction phase. Harrison's injuries were serious but not incapacitating, and his experience working with military personnel had prepared him for operations that would test his physical and mental capabilities. Webb and Kim maintained security while Rodriguez prepared Harrison for movement, but the time required for medical assessment and equipment distribution was alerting guards to unusual activity in areas where routine had been disrupted. Their window of opportunity for undetected extraction was closing, and remaining in the compound much longer would guarantee engagement with hostile forces that outnumbered them significantly. "Time to go," Rodriguez announced, and the extraction phase of their mission began. The extraction from the compound required different tactics than the infiltration because their presence was no longer secret, and their movement was constrained by Harrison's physical limitations and their need to move as a unit through terrain that favored defensive forces familiar with the area. Rodriguez led the movement, with Harrison positioned between him and Webb, while Kim provided rear security and monitored for pursuit that could compromise their escape route. The route back to the perimeter followed a different path than their approach, avoiding areas where they might encounter guards who had discovered evidence of their infiltration. But the compound's defensive layout was designed to prevent exactly the kind of movement they were attempting, and progress was slower than operational security required. At 1847 hours, their presence was definitively compromised when a guard patrol discovered evidence of their breach and raised an alarm that brought the entire security force to active response. The advantage of surprise was lost, and their extraction became a fighting withdrawal through terrain where defensive forces had every tactical advantage. The first engagement occurred as they reached the compound perimeter, when guard positions that had not been neutralized during their infiltration detected their movement and opened fire with automatic weapons that turned their escape route into a killing zone. Rodriguez and Webb returned fire with precision that neutralized immediate threats, but the engagement revealed their position to additional hostile forces that began coordinating to prevent their escape. Kim identified an alternate route that would avoid the primary defensive positions, but required technical climbing that would challenge Harrison's physical capabilities and slow their movement, when speed was becoming critical for survival. The choice was between accepting the tactical disadvantage of their current route or accepting the time disadvantage of more difficult terrain. Both options carry risks that could prove fatal. "We take the climb," Rodriguez decided, Better to control our own timing than let them control the engagement. The technical climbing phase of their extraction tested every element of their mountain warfare training and equipment. Rodriguez led the climb, establishing anchor points and routes that Webb and Kim could follow, while supporting Harrison through sections that exceeded his climbing experience. The process was methodical but time-consuming, and pursuit forces were adapting their tactics to cut off escape routes that led away from the compound. Harrison's performance during the climbing phase exceeded expectations, demonstrating physical capabilities and mental toughness that complemented his technical expertise. But the combination of his injuries, the physical demands of technical climbing, and the stress of combat was approaching the limits of human endurance. At 1923 hours, they cleared the most difficult section of the climb and reached terrain where normal hiking was possible, but pursuit forces had anticipated their route and established blocking positions that would force engagement under conditions where the defenders had tactical advantage. Rodriguez assessed their situation, identify approach routes that could be used by hostile forces and defensive positions that could provide temporary security while they planned their next movement. Contact front, Webb announced, identifying enemy positions that blocked their primary escape route. At least 6 hostiles in prepared positions, automatic weapons, good fields of fire. Kim moved to provide overwatch while Rodriguez analyzed tactical options that range from direct assault to lengthy detour through terrain that would expose them to additional threats. Every option carried significant risks, but remaining in their current position would allow pursuit forces to coordinate attacks that would overwhelm their defensive capabilities. The engagement that followed tested every aspect of their training, equipment, and coordination. Rodriguez and Webb maneuvered against defensive positions, while Kim provided covering fire and protected Harrison, who contributed by providing battlefield intelligence based on his observations of enemy tactics and positioning. The firefight was brief but intense, with precisely aimed shots that neutralized hostile threats while conserving ammunition that would be needed for subsequent engagements. Their superior training and equipment provided tactical advantages that overcame the numerical superiority of defensive forces, but the engagement had alerted additional hostile forces to their location and route of movement. 2 down, others withdrew, Webb reported, but we got movement on both flanks. They're trying to surround us. Rodriguez understood that their tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. They had achieved their primary objective of rescuing Harrison, but extraction through hostile territory was becoming more difficult with each engagement. We keep moving. Stop moving and we're dead. The final phase of their extraction became a running battle through mountain terrain that tested every survival skill they had developed and every bond of trust that held them together as a unit. Pursuit forces had adapted their tactics to the realities of fighting operators whose training exceeded their own, using superior numbers and terrain knowledge to create engagements where special operations capabilities couldn't compensate for overwhelming disadvantage. Rodriguez led their movement through terrain that provided concealment but limited their speed of advance, while Webb and Kim alternated between providing security and assisting Harrison through sections that challenged his physical capabilities. The coordination was seamless, but the cumulative effects of combat stress, physical exhaustion, and equipment consumption were approaching critical thresholds. At 20:34 hours, they reached a ridge line that provided observation terrain leading toward their extraction point, but the route was controlled by defensive positions that could not be bypassed without extensive detour through areas where additional hostile forces were likely positioned. The tactical situation required direct action against prepared defensive positions, with success depending on coordination and precision that would have to be executed perfectly under conditions that made mistakes inevitable. There's no way around, Webb assessed, studying the terrain through optics that revealed defensive positions designed to control movement through the valley. We go through or we don't go at all. Kim checked his ammunition, calculating consumption rates against remaining operational requirements. I've got maybe 60 rounds left. After that, we're down to Harrison's expertise in theoretical physics. Rodriguez understood that they were approaching the decision point that defined special operations, the moment when success required accepting risks that conventional forces couldn't justify. Harrison, I need you to understand what we're facing. We can attempt assault on those positions, but the probability of success is marginal at best. Harrison's response demonstrated understanding that had been developed through years of working with military personnel in situations where theoretical knowledge had to be applied under conditions that tested both intellectual and physical capabilities. What are my options for contributing to the assault? You stay here, stay down, and stay alive while we clear the route. If we succeed, we continue extraction. If we fail, Rodriguez paused. If we fail, you surrender and hope they value your knowledge more than their anger. And the probability of success of the assault? Rodriguez exchanged glances with Webb and Kim, sharing calculations that included factors beyond military tactics. Fatigue levels that reduced coordination, ammunition consumption that limited options, and pursuit forces that were learning to counter their capabilities. Honestly, maybe 30%. Harrison was quiet for a moment, processing odds that would have seemed hopeless to civilian assessment, but represented acceptable risk to soldiers whose training prepared them for situations where conventional solutions didn't exist. Then we'd better make sure we're in the 30%. The assault on the defensive positions required coordination that exceeded anything they had attempted during the mission, with Webb providing covering fire while Rodriguez and Kim maneuvered against positions that were designed to prevent exactly the kind of approach they were attempting. Harrison contributed by observing enemy positions and providing intelligence that allowed them to time their movement with precision that maximized their chances of success. The engagement was the most intense of their mission, with automatic weapons fire that turned the mountainside into a storm of ricochets and flying rock fragments. But their superior training and coordination allowed them to neutralize defensive positions with casualties that could have been much worse, clearing the route toward their extraction point while maintaining capability to continue movement. "Route is clear," Kim reported, but his voice carried strain that indicated wounds sustained during the assault. "I can still move, but I'm going to need medical attention when we reach extraction." Rodriguez assessed Kim's condition, determining that he was mobile but not at full operational capability. The wounds were serious but not immediately life-threatening, but they would slow movement and reduce combat effectiveness if additional engagements became necessary. Webb moved to support Kim while Rodriguez helped Harrison navigate terrain that led toward their extraction point, still 8 kilometers away through mountains where additional hostile forces could be positioned. Their tactical situation had improved with the elimination of the blocking positions, but pursuit forces were still coordinating to prevent their escape. At 2,156 hours, they reached the extraction point where transportation waited to carry them to safety. The vehicle was nondescript, operated by personnel whose identities would never be officially acknowledged, equipped for movement through terrain that would challenge conventional transportation. Harrison was evacuated to medical facilities where his injuries could be properly treated and where intelligence specialists could assess the information he had gathered during his captivity. Rodriguez, Webb, and Kim returned to their unit, where their unauthorized mission would be investigated by commanders who understood the difference between following orders and following principles that transcended regulations. The official report of their mission would be classified at levels that ensured it would never be publicly acknowledged. Harrison's rescue would be attributed to intelligence operations that couldn't be discussed for operational security reasons. Rodriguez, Webb, and Kim would face disciplinary action for violating regulations, but they would also receive recognition that couldn't be officially documented for actions that exemplified the values that made special operations effective. 6 months later, Rodriguez, Webb, and Kim were reassigned to different units, their careers affected by decisions to prioritize loyalty over regulations, but their reputations enhanced among operators who understood that some principles couldn't be compromised regardless of official policy. Harrison returned to classified work, but with understanding that his survival had depended on people who valued personal bonds over bureaucratic considerations. The mission became a case study in special operations training, taught as an example of how small units could accomplish objectives that conventional forces couldn't attempt. But the official analysis focused on tactics and equipment rather than the motivations that had made the mission possible. The willingness of 3 soldiers to risk everything for someone who had earned their loyalty through shared experiences that created obligations stronger than orders. Harrison never spoke publicly about his capture or rescue, understanding that acknowledgement would compromise the careers of people who had saved his life. But he continued working with special operations personnel, contributing expertise that enhanced their capabilities while building relationships that honored the sacrifice made by soldiers who proved that some bonds couldn't be broken by distance, danger, or direct orders to abandon someone who needed help. The compound in the Hindu Kush Mountains was abandoned shortly after the rescue, its occupants disappearing into the endless cycle of conflict that defined the region. But the mountain peaks that had witnessed the mission continued to stand, silent guardians of secrets that would never be fully told, markers of places where ordinary people had done extraordinary things because they understood that true strength came not from following orders, but from following principles that defined who they were when everything else was stripped away. Rodriguez returned to Montana, where he eventually became an instructor at the Mountain Warfare Training Center, teaching soldiers how to survive in terrain that had tested his own capabilities beyond anything he had thought possible. Webb continued serving in special operations, participating in missions that officially never happened but contributed to stability in regions where conventional solutions couldn't address the complexities of modern conflict. Kim recovered from his injuries and transitioned to civilian life, but remained connected to the special operations community through consulting work that allowed him to contribute expertise while building a life that honored both his military service and his understanding that some experiences change people in ways that made normal careers seem inadequate to the relationships and principles that had been tested under conditions where failure meant death. The story of their unauthorized mission spread through military networks as an example of loyalty that transcended regulations, but was never officially documented or acknowledged. Some legends don't need official recognition. They live in shared understanding of people who have faced similar choices and know that true heroism isn't measured by following orders, but by following principles that remain constant when everything else is uncertain. Harrison continued his classified work, but with a deeper understanding of the people who protected him and the sacrifices they made to ensure that knowledge served justice rather than the highest bidder. His expertise contributed to defensive capabilities that kept weapons of mass destruction out of the hands of people who would use them against innocent populations, work that honored the risks taken by soldiers who proved that some people are never abandoned, never forgotten, never left behind when others have the capability to bring them home. In a world where loyalty is often measured by convenience and heroism is often confused with publicity, the story of Rodriguez, Webb, and Kim reminds us that true legends are written by people who choose principle over policy, who risk everything for bonds that can't be broken by bureaucracy, and who understand that the most important victories are often the ones that officially never happened, but created outcomes that made the world a better place for people who will never know the names of, those who sacrificed everything to make their safety possible. Some missions succeed because of superior firepower, better intelligence, or overwhelming tactical advantage. Others succeed because of something much more powerful: the unwillingness of good people to abandon someone who needs help, regardless of the cost, regardless of the odds, regardless of the orders that say some people aren't worth the risk of saving. The rescue of Dr. Michael Harrison proved that when principles meet capability, when loyalty meets skill, when determination meets opportunity, the impossible becomes inevitable, and legends are born from the simple decision to do what's right regardless of what's officially authorized.